Hello, I'm Aneka from Made to Sew, and this is day 2 in our beginner's guide to sewing, and we're going to start today by looking at fabrics. So I really wanted to go through with you the kind of fabrics that you should be looking for, especially when you're a beginner, so that you're not working with something that's really difficult and that you find troublesome and therefore puts you off your sewing journey. So we're going to start, I would suggest, with sort of a cotton-based fabric. So a variety of cottons will work. I would choose really sort of a medium weight fabric, but I would aim for a cotton or a poly cotton. You could try something that's sort of a lightweight upholstery fabric, you know, that would sort of do the job as well, or even a linen. This is a linen here, or a mix, should I say. And as long as it's sort of got a good medium body, it isn't stretchy, and when you're choosing if you want something that is patterned, you want to make sure that the pattern won't require matching, because again, that's another slightly more complicated skill that again may put you off. So choose something that is going to be easy for you to start with. The one thing you also need to take into consideration is the width of the fabric, because fabric does come in different widths. Now, generally speaking, you've got on average a 45-inch width, which is 115 centimetres, and a 60-inch width, which is 150 centimetres. Now, if you're working from a pattern, what I would recommend is that you check on the back of the pattern, and there will be little instructions about the width of the fabric that you're working with and what size or what amount you need for that width. So it's always best to check that before you go out and start looking. There are occasions when some patterns do require the fabric to say be on a 60-inch width, 150 centimetres, to make sure that the pattern pieces actually fit onto that. So just check before you go out searching for something that may not work for what you're wanting to make. The next thing you'll need to collect is some pins and some cutting utensils. So either scissors or a rotary cutter, whichever really work best for you. Either of those are absolutely fine. And what I want to go through next with you is how to find the grain line and the selvage of your fabric, and then how to actually put a pattern onto it. So how do you pin it? What is the best practice? And what is the grain line? So join me back here and we'll get started. So we're going to start by looking at the selvage edge of the fabric and how to find it. Now, the selvage is the finished edge of the fabric when it was made on the loom. Now you can see it's slightly different on a variety of different fabrics. On this fabric it's a white strip, and it can be like that on some others. You can see another one there. On other fabrics it can be as a fraying edge. You can see on this navy here that it's as a fraying edge. On some fabrics you won't have a fraying edge or a white strip to guide you to that selvage, and you're going to be looking for an edge with ever so tiny little dots, which is how the fabric was put on the loom when it was made. So as long as you've got this finished edge of the fabric, you will be able to find where the grain line is, because the grain line is always parallel to the selvage edge. Now, I also wanted to explain about the right side and wrong side of fabric. When you've got a printed fabric, it's very easy to see because the print is on the right side. The wrong side is obviously a lighter, not printed finish. The same goes for this fabric here. This would be the wrong side. Obviously this nice bright red is the right side. Now when it comes to plain fabrics, it's slightly more difficult because either side could really be the right side and you could use. So it's down to your choice really. Whichever side would work best for you and your project, then that's absolutely fine to go with. It's your decision to make. So now we've gone through the right side, wrong side, and you found the selvage of your fabric. We're going to meet back here and actually look at laying on a pattern onto the fabric and where the grain line is. As we ascertained in the last section of the tutorial, the selvage is this white bar that's running along the edge of the fabric here, and the grain line is parallel to that. This is our vertical grain line. If I position that down like that, our grain line will be running vertically in line with this selvage. Now before we start cutting out something, we need to find what their horizontal grain line is. Often when fabric's cut off the bolt, you'll find that this won't be cut very straight and it won't therefore be true. Now you can't true this with all fabrics, but if you are working with a cotton, the best thing to do is to actually cut and rip, which can be quite scary for some people, but I'll show you how to do that now. So what you want to do is take your fabric and you want to cut into the selvage edge, make a little cut, and then you're literally going to pull both of the pieces and rip all the way along. And what that will do is make sure that the horizontal grain of your piece of material is correct. Okay, I'd always recommend giving it a bit of a press afterwards. Now you will find with some fabrics they will not rip. If you've got a pattern, you can use the pattern to match it up down this edge, and I would draw a line along the pattern and then cut it off. If you haven't, then really the way to find it is put your two right sides together, which is what we'll be doing anyway. So right side's always inside. And we obviously, because we've got our horizontal grain correct, we can line up the horizontal and the vertical, so the two selvages together. If you're working with a fabric where you haven't been able to true the horizontal grain, what you want to do is to check the folded edge of the fabric and make sure that this is not twisted at any point. This needs to sit nice and flat and straight. Okay, so two right sides together, selvage is lining up down here, horizontal grain is true. And we're going to put some pins through the selvages to join them together. So I'll let you pin your fabric together, and you just want to put enough, they don't need to be too close together, just enough really to hold the pieces together whilst we work. So I'll let you pin your fabric and then join me back here and we'll start laying a pattern onto the fabric. So now you're prepared to put your pattern onto your fabric. We've got our fabric right sides together, pinned down the selvage, and our horizontal grain line is true. Now on your pattern pieces, whether you're working with dressmaking or home decor, you'll find that they have a line with an arrow on them, which states grain line. Okay, now it's really important this line is parallel to our selvage, because the selvage or the vertical grain line of the fabric is very strong and secure and doesn't have any stretch. Whereas if you were to position this incorrectly on the fabric, you may find that you pick up a bit of bias. And the bias of the fabric is the 45-degree angle. If you see here, that has got some stretch. So it will completely change the look of a garment or a product that you're making if you get this wrong. So it's important to make sure grain line is in line with the selvage. And to do that, we're going to use a tape measure to measure it. Now, you can either measure from the edge of the selvage or the edge of the little white part of the selvage there. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So I'm going to measure from the edge of the white bit, and I'm going to measure to my grain line. And you can move it. I tend to move the pattern slightly so that I'm on an even number that I like and that's easy to remember. And this is 3.5 inches. And I tend to use pattern weights to hold my pattern piece down whilst I measure the other end. So you only need to measure one at this end and one at this end of the grain line. Obviously bigger pattern pieces will have longer grain lines, so then you'll need to check. And this up this edge needs to be moved a smidgen towards the grain line. So I'm just going to, with the weight on, just pivot my pattern piece ever so slightly, and then I'm going to check that that's 3.5. And then again, I will double check the end here, and that is also 3.5. So when you're happy that your grain line is completely in line to your selvage edge, we will then place some pins around the pattern. Now, this is another little tip of mine. I tend to always pin in what would be the seam allowance. Now, most domestic sort of dressmaking patterns have got a seam allowance included in them, which is 5/8, 1.5 centimetres. And so I pin in what would be the seam allowance to make sure that if I was to be working with a delicate fabric, that the pin wouldn't mark or damage the fabric. It's one of those things that's best practice. If you do it all of the time, you won't then be working with a lovely silk or a fabric that might be skagged by the pin and then wish that you hadn't pinned in the centre and that you had pinned around the edge. So I tend to always pin around the edges of the pattern piece. And again, you just need enough to make it stay flat and secure. You don't need to overload it with pins. One other little thing I wanted to point out actually before we move on from the grain line is that here we've got a nice edge to the selvage. If you had a fluffy fraying edge to the selvage when you were measuring your grain line, you want to make sure that you measure not from the fluffy edge, because that could be inconsistent, but from the line in from that. So like I chose to go from the white line here in. Okay, so if you measure your grain lines of your pattern pieces and pin all around them, join me back here because I want to show you how you would pin something on the fold next. So to help you pin the rest of your pattern on, I wanted to show you what to do if you were to have an item that needs to be pinned on the fold. Now, rather than having the arrows, you'll have a little arrow that bumps in and out, and it will normally say cut on fold or centre front on fold, like this pattern does. Now what that means is that you need to position this edge of the pattern completely flush with the fold of the fabric. So you really want to position it so that you can't see any of the fabric past the edge of the pattern. Now in this case you will find that you probably need to put a couple of pins down this edge to hold it in place, and that's fine, but just bear in mind, think about your fabric before you do pin into it, because you don't want to be damaging something that, you know, can be quite expensive nowadays. So I'll position a few pins in there, and then again I'll start pinning around the edge in the seam allowance of my pattern piece. Now I'll let you go ahead and pin your things on, and then we'll start by cutting out. So now you have your pattern pieces pinned onto the fabric, we're going to cut them out. Now there's sort of two methods you can use to cut these out. You can either use a pair of dressmaking scissors, or you can try and use a rotary cutter. And to use that you will need a board that will protect obviously your table, and potentially a ruler, whether it be a safety ruler or just a normal ruler to help you with the straight edges. Now I'm going to start by showing you how to use the pair of scissors, and then we'll move on to working with the rotary cutter. Now when working with scissors I sort of only really have one tip, and that's to keep the pattern and what you're cutting to the left of the scissors wherever possible. And when you're cutting you really want to make sure that the fabric stays as flat as possible, so you're not sort of lifting it up. You really want to just put the scissor edge underneath and do long strokes. You don't want to be cutting sort of tiny bits, you want to be doing long strokes, and that will make it a much neater, cleaner cut. So if that's the method you choose, I will let you go ahead and cut out your piece. As I said, you can once you're moving along, you can move the fabric, and I don't get a pin obviously, you can move the fabric around, so I would then move my fabric around nice and flat to cut this edge, keeping the pattern to the left of the scissors wherever possible, and you will get a much neater, closer edge cutting that in that way. So if you want to have a go with the rotary cutter, then what we would try is, with a rotary cutter like this, you need to make sure that the blade is obviously open so that you are going to be able to cut with it. And really with the rotary cutter you guys are going to have to press quite hard, and this depends on the fabric that you're using. Obviously lighter weight fabrics will be easier to cut than heavier weights, and I tend to sort of end up doing a little bit of a run up so that when you're getting onto the fabric you really are cutting it nice and neatly. And if you're doing a straight edge like this, then the ruler might come in handy so that you can line up the edge of the pattern with the ruler, and then you can cut along the edge of the ruler. And you may, I've got a little bit there you see, so you may then have to just go over a bit now and again if you haven't pressed quite hard enough. Oh, there we go. So have a go with both, see which work better for you. Some people prefer scissors, some people prefer a rotary cutter. And also bear in mind that obviously because we've got the two layers of fabric right sides pinned together, we are cutting out two of everything. Obviously if you only need one of something, you can cut it out with one layer, and I would then cut it out with your right side facing up. Okay, so cut out the pieces that you're working with your project, and then join me back here, leave the pattern on the fabric, and we're going to look at how to mark the notches and all of the details from the pattern onto the fabric. So hopefully you've now found that you've been able to cut out all of your pattern pieces okay. Next what you'll need to do is actually mark some of the markings from the pattern onto the fabric. On a dressmaking pattern, you'll find that there are these little notches, the little triangles. They will always move around the body, so the greater the number will be towards the back of the body. It normally starts with 1 at the front, 2 at the sides, maybe 3 at the back. And how I find it easiest to mark these, especially when you're a beginner, is using carbon paper. Okay, now this is carbon paper. You can buy it on a big roll, like this transfer paper thing, or you can buy sort of smaller sheets that are just perfect for dressmaking. And they come in different colours, so obviously you'll use the colour that shows up on your fabric the best. The one thing that I would recommend though, if you're using a very light coloured fabric, like white, that I would probably try and see if I could see the white on the white, because you will find that the other colours will mark and potentially stain the fabric, and until you've washed it they won't come off. So I'm going to position this under the, well, if this is going to go onto the wrong side of my fabric, because obviously we've got our right sides together in the middle, and I'm going to sit that on top. And all I'm going to do is, using a little tracing wheel, is actually wheel the notch onto the pattern. And you can just about see them on the reverse there. Now when I'm doing the little triangles, you're welcome to do a triangle if you prefer. I tend to just do a straight line from through the middle of the triangle, and to me then I'll just have 2 lines on the wrong side of my fabric, and that makes sense to me. Now the other markings that you would need to mark is if you've got any circles. I tend to do the circles as an X, so just an X through the piece, and that works for me. You would need to mark any darts if you had them. This is a pattern piece with a dart, so I would wheel along this line and back down this line. So you can mark anything that you really need to take from pattern onto the fabric. Now, just to add, if you don't have any of these markings, and if you maybe don't have the carbon paper and don't want to use that, what you could do instead of marking the carbon paper on is actually cut into the notches. And you could just snip, move that out of the way a second, you could just snip just into the V's. And you don't want to snip too far because you don't want to cut past the seam allowance, but just 2 little snips, and that will give you a little cut in the fabric, which will then show you where those are, because obviously a notch should match up to another notch at a certain point. Now to mark the other side, so at the moment we've only marked this one side with the carbon paper, we need to mark this side with the carbon paper as well. So what I tend to do is take the pattern off my pieces of fabric, and then I'll leave a couple of pins just to hold the bits of fabric together. So if we relieve the pattern piece, and then just put a couple of pins, because you don't want them to shift, again pinning in the seam allowance. And then I'm going to turn my piece of fabric over. Okay, so I can see the markings very clearly. I've got my notch there, and I've got my X here. Now I'm going to put the paper underneath this side. So the paper, and the side of the paper, this is always the darker side. If you put your finger on it, you know, it will come off on your fingers, and I'd always recommend washing your hands after use. And this will transfer onto the wrong side always of the fabric. You don't want to get this onto the right side. And we're going to use the markings that we made previously to mark this side. Okay, and the same for the notch here. I always tend to wheel away from myself. I do find that that's easier, but again, if you would rather wheel towards yourself, it's whatever works for you. And there's the marking there. So this is one way of doing markings onto pattern pieces. If you join me back here in a second, I'm going to show you another way of doing that. So before we finish our day 2 tutorial with working with our fabric, I just wanted to go through another few other tools that you could use to mark your fabric if you wanted to. Now obviously we looked at marking it with carbon paper, and that works well for most fabrics really, especially when you're a beginner and you're going to be working with the cottons, the linens, all of those kind of things. However, if you wanted something that maybe you didn't have a pattern but you just wanted to put a few marks that needed matching up, or maybe a corner that needed to be turned, then these are the sort of the tools that I use for these jobs. This is a pen that comes off with water. You can also buy one that comes off in time, so with air, gradually. And this, if you mark this on, you can see the blue line coming up here. So I tend to use this if maybe there's a spot that I want to stop at a certain point, or if maybe I was sewing down this seam here and I was turning a corner and I need to make sure my corner was correct. I might measure in my 5/8 one side, and then measure in my 5/8 the other side to give myself a nice corner to work with. And because this comes off with water, it's very handy. The other tools that you could use are a little bit of chalk or these chalk pens, which I prefer. I think they're a little bit more accurate. They come in a variety of different colours. I've got the white and the yellow here. Probably the white you wouldn't see on this, but the yellow, if I draw a line there, they make a very neat, nice line. So again, if maybe I was marking something that I wanted to stitch onto a garment, or maybe some quilting lines, then this would be perfect for that job. So there are lots of tools out there. These are just some of my preferences and ways that you can mark your fabric as you need to. I hope you've enjoyed days 2 of the beginner's crash course in sewing, and hopefully you've learned a few things on how to work with your fabric. I look forward to seeing you in day 3.